In this series, from What's Going On with Shipping, we look at the history of the Military Sealift Command in 5 episodes. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So we're going to look at the Military Sea Transportation Service, what becomes the Military Sealift Command, during 2 seminal events early in its history. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and then the Vietnam War, 1965, roughly, to 1975. Both of those conflicts are really seminal for the creation of MSTS, Military Sea Transportation Service, and then it's morphing over into Military Sealift Command. If you missed our first episode, we looked at the formation of the Military Sea Transportation Service back in 1949, when the Navy Transportation Service, the Army Transport Service, and Op 422, the Petroleum and Tanker Branch of the Chief of Naval Operations Office, were all merged together into one entity under the command of Admiral William Callahan. Today we're going to look at the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the impact it has. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So the Korean War has been identified as kind of the first test in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union and subsequently the People's Republic of China, which coincidentally created itself on October 1st, 1949, the same day that Military Sealift Command came into being. The Korean War, which starts on June 25th of 1950, when forces of North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, invade South Korea, the Republic of Korea, this was seminal for MSTS. On July 1st of 1950, the Army Transport Service, 33 vessels stationed out in Japan and in and around the Far East, were slated to be transferred over to MSTS. However, the invasion by North Korea of South Korea accelerated that. And almost immediately, with the UN declaration to support South Korea and to send forces, the commander of what was going to become MSTS Far East, Military Sea Transportation Service Far East, Captain Alexander F. Junker, was tasked with deploying parts of the occupation force in Japan to Korea, specifically the 24th and 25th Infantry Divisions. He very quickly got together with his Army counterpart and started moving over first supplies, ammunition, equipment for the Republic of Korea's army, but then also shuttling over vessels as needed. One of the vessels that proved absolutely essential to this operation was the landing ship tank. Now, LSTs had proved their worth during World War II. I talked about LSTs during the D-Day commemoration on the 80th anniversary. But immediately in Korea, because of the underdeveloped ports, there was a need to do logistics over the shore, to move cargo right over the beaches, because the ports, mainly the port of Incheon, was overburdened with vessels, and there needed to be the movement of equipment very quickly into Korea. However, the U.S. Navy lacked sufficient landing ship tanks. However, a force of 38 LSTs had been given to General MacArthur as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Japan, and he subsequently had turned those vessels over to the Japanese for the Japanese to operate in and around the islands of Japan to move supplies and equipment. These vessels were earmarked, transferred over to Military Sea Transportation Service, including their Japanese crews. So in 1950, you're literally going to have U.S.-flagged LSTs with Japanese crews hauling cargo and equipment over to Korea as part of an operation. And matter of fact, Japanese, Korean, and Ryukyu crewing of LSTs and sealift vessels out in the Far East would be commonplace until the end of the Vietnam War. This was not an uncommon occurrence. But LSTs proved essential, and Captain Alexander Junker proved his worth in his ability to get supplies into Korea rapidly and help sustain the forces that retreated southward into the Pusan perimeter. In 1952, Captain Junker would receive the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for his actions. I just want to read part of it here. From 5 June 1950 to 15 November 1951, Captain Junker resolutely overcame the many complex problems involved in transporting hundreds of thousands of troops and millions of tons of necessary equipment and supplies for the successful prosecution of the action in Korea. During the period between July 1950 and April 1951, the command delivered over 70% of the total worldwide deliveries of the entire MSTS. He planned, established, and supervised the many new units of his command, meeting the numerous and varied needs for shipping during the required Sealift, including the vital amphibious operations at Incheon, Iwon, Wonsan, and Hungnam. The operations in and around Korea are a fascinating story, and there is actually a great reference source for it. This is James Field's book on naval operations during the Korean War. It is actually available online. I'll have the link in the show notes down below via the Navy's History and Heritage Command. So this has entirely been digitized, put online so that you can read it. I think it's a great resource. A little dry at times, but it has some great data, as we're going to show in a minute. But one of the most famous events that comes out of the Korean War in terms of Sealift is the evacuation of Hungnam. When the U.S. and the UN allies were able to hold the Pusan perimeter, execute the Incheon invasion, and drive North Korea back into North Korea, General MacArthur and the UN forces went into North Korea, actually captured Pyongyang, and got up to the Yalu River, occupying nearly all of North Korea. That's when China interceded and rolled across the border. The United States had to stage an evacuation of the U.S. 10th Corps, along with Republic of Korea forces, out of the port of Hungnam. And one of the most famous events happens on board the SS Meredith Victory. It's the subject of this book right here, Ship of Miracles, 14,000 lives and one miraculous voyage. The SS Meredith Victory, one of those standard victory ships I talked about in the last episode, was able to carry 12 passengers. On a voyage from Hungnam, they carried 14,000 Korean refugees. It's one of the most amazing stories in the history of military sea transportation service. Doesn't get told enough. This ship was a victory ship broken out of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. This is the reserve fleet of laid-up ships left over after World War II. One of the things that happens during the Korean War is that we pull ships from the commercial merchant marine to help. So, for example, when the 2nd Infantry Division has to be deployed from Fort Lewis, Washington, over to Korea, we call upon the commercial merchant marine to provide ships, but those ships are needed to get back into routine regular service. They can't be dedicated for military Sealift. So we tap into that reserve fleet sitting there in the anchorages, pull them out, and the ship like SS Meredith Victory is a perfect example of that. One of those reserve ships that's brought out. The story of the ship, the crew, the captain is an amazing story. I don't want to ruin it for you because I may do a separate episode on it, but just a fantastic story. But the Korean War demonstrates that while this is a limited war, the need for Sealift across the vast reaches of the Pacific to get all the way to Korea is as daunting, if not more, than what we saw in World War II. So I want to read from this chart from James Field's Korea. It provides some really interesting information. What is needed to support a modern transoceanic war of even limited dimensions may be indicated by a few figures. For World War II, the average monthly Pacific outbound cargo came to 1,085,000 tons. In 1953, it fluctuated between 880,000 and 1.4 million tons. It goes on here, it may be noted that MSTS operated more than 70 ships within the Far Eastern Theater, moving 626 tons and 74,000 persons a month. When you go into this chart, which gives you the monthly requirements for Korea, you can see it there for provisions, ammunition, personnel, fuel oil, gasoline. They required monthly 117 ships. To get 117 ships to arrive monthly in Korea, you had to have 251 other ships in the pipeline, either coming to or coming from Korea. That is a fleet of 368 vessels. goes on that there were two factors beyond the Korean War that deserved attention. The first relates to the problems of petroleum procurement and to the extent in which the ability to make war may be subject to developments independent of the belligerents' control. The second concerns the nature of the theater of operations and its influence upon the magnitude of military effort. I will add a third to that list. At the same time that Korea is going on, the United States has decided to deploy forces for the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949 also. That involved the movement of 4 divisions and then the rotation of those divisions on a constant basis. That devoted a lot of tonnage going across the Atlantic to Europe. So at the same time that you're going across the Pacific to Korea, you have this other force that's going across the Atlantic to Europe. And this is probably a good harbinger for what the modern military Sealift Command could face in potential operations in the near future. Conflict in Taiwan, for example, or a conflict in Europe, all that would require the dual source. And I think it's really interesting to note how a limited war in Korea required more cargo, more fuel than a unlimited war did in the Pacific just a few years earlier. In many ways, the stats that we use for warfare always are far below what we actually wind up using. That takes us over to the Vietnam War. Now, the Korean War was a huge lesson for MSTS. In many ways, it was their raison d'etre, their reason to be for existence. There was a big call at the end of the creation of MSTS that maybe we did not need such a large commercial government fleet. But one of the things that became readily apparent because of the Korean War is that the Department of Defense needed an organization to be able to oversee Sealift, and it needed to use not just the commercial merchant marine, which was essential for getting goods to Korea very quickly and very, very fast at the beginning of the conflict, but also needed that backup of a fleet operated by MSTS and then a reserve fleet in the anchorages from ships left over from the World War II shipbuilding program. Vietnam, in many ways, followed right in the footsteps of Korea. 1965, you see it. Now, I know a little bit about this topic because, again, I literally wrote a book on this one. This is one of the things I did write. This is my book, Fourth Armed Defense, Sealift and Maritime Logistics in the Vietnam War. It was part of a 9-volume series done by the Navy History and Heritage Command on the Vietnam War. I will have the link to this. You can download a PDF for it. Since I did it for the Navy History and Heritage Command, you can actually download the whole thing and read it at your leisure. I'll have it there for you. The Vietnam War was a really interesting one because in many ways it paralleled Korea. There was a call in 1965 for the movement of troops to Vietnam. There's the great movie We Were Soldiers, which documents and kind of details the 1st Cavalry Division in the Ia Drang Valley. One of the things I hate about the movie, besides the ending's terrible, but besides that part, is that one minute they're in Fort Benning, Georgia, the next minute they're in Vietnam. You don't see that kind of Sealift element. That's a key thing. The United States had to call in commercial vessels. Matter of fact, the U.S. Merchant Marine was on strike in 1965 on the East Coast, but the U.S. Merchant Marine put aside the strike to help deploy the 1st Cavalry Division over to Vietnam. They had to use an aircraft carrier, the USS Boxer, which was actually used in the Korean War to deploy P-51s, then called F-51 Mustangs, to Korea. In 1965, the Boxer rekindled that mission, except it didn't carry fighters, it carried helicopters over. And the Vietnam War was a big issue because one of the problems they had in the Vietnam War was the port system there. The ports were not able to accommodate all the ships coming in. So this is from my booklet on the Vietnam War, and again, I'll have it for you to download. The buildup of forces is very unique. There are 2 absolutely essential MSTS commanders at this time. Vice Admiral Glyn Dunk Donahoe and Vice Admiral Lawson Red Ramage. And if those names are familiar, they're submariners, pretty famous submariners, especially Red Ramage from World War II. And it was really interesting putting submarine commanders in charge of military Sealift. Red Ramage was asked what did he know about merchant marine. He said, I know how to destroy it, because he did a very good job of that in World War II. But he also knew how to operate it. And those 2 were really essential for parts of this early buildup. Setting up the Trans-Pacific logistics operation was a feat unto itself, and one of the things I like to focus in here is the role of civilians, both ashore and afloat, that provided the background for this. We tend to forget that this was basically, MSTS was the largest shipping line in the world at the time, and it tapped into not just government shipping, but commercial shipping. And so you saw operating firms like Line and Sea Train, APL, and a variety of other major shipping lines all contribute to the operation of ships. Plus, there wasn't sufficient ships to devote solely to the Vietnam operation. So once again, we tapped into that National Defense Reserve Fleet, broke out ships from the reserve fleet, and sent them over. One of the key aspects beyond just moving cargo into Vietnam was you had to move cargo within Vietnam, intra-theater. And one of the operations that is undertaken is the movement of a group known as the Alaska Barge and Tug Company, AB&T. They had been instrumental in developing the DEW line, the Distant Early Warning Line on the north coast of Alaska and Canada, which we're going to talk about in episode 3. They were brought in to operate a tug and barge service along the coast of Vietnam. Add to it those LSTs that had been used by MSTS during the Korean War are once again in play off the coast of Vietnam. We also see the development of new ports and piers at Cam Ranh and Da Nang, the use of what are called the long piers. You see the difficulty the United States is having in Gaza in establishing a pier. Well, in Vietnam, we established ports out of nowhere, and that was one of the key features, was creating these brand new ports so that we can move cargo into Vietnam more efficiently. One of the type of vessels that made its appearance in Vietnam was the container ship. Great book. Mark Levinson's The Bach has a whole chapter on this. The Bach talks about how Malcolm McLean and Sealand had not been able to make the container ship a viable product. Well, McLean had sent 3 of his people to the U.S. Army to sell them on the idea of container ships into Vietnam. In November of 1965, there were 122 ships waiting to offload in Vietnam. The container ship alleviated that backlog. It became not just efficient, but fast. And one of the things that McLean sold the military on is not only will he offload the boxes in Cam Ranh and Da Nang, but his system will deliver the containers to operating depots and forward bases within 35 miles of the port. One of the things in Vietnam was merchant mariners came under direct fire. 13 vessels were sunk in Vietnam. I estimate somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 merchant mariners were killed as a result of actions or sailing to and from Vietnam. There are mines in the Rung Sat. This is the river that heads from the South China Sea up to the port of Saigon. And then there were attacks via the Forest of Assassins, the Rung Sat, against shipping in the area. So it was a very dangerous and volatile area for both merchant crews and the Navy crews that swept the mines and the U.S. military crews that provided protection. Probably one of the most famous events in Vietnam was the evacuation. Now, most people associate the evacuation of Vietnam with helicopters on the roof of the U.S. Embassy, but in truth, most people got out of Vietnam by sealift, either by the boat lift, small boats coming out of Vietnam, but they were met by ships of the Military Sealift Command, renamed in 1970. And you see a list here of ships that carried out survivors and evacuees. SS American Challenger brought out over 23,000 refugees. The Pioneer Contender brought out 34,200. Now, that was not in one voyage, but multiple voyages that they came out. So in the booklet, I have several vignettes that focus on key topics, but I want to focus on 3 vignettes with you real quick because they're in the booklet, but there are also feature books that talk about them. So one of them is this book right here, Sailing into the Abyss. This is William Bentiel. He talks about the true story of extreme heroism on the high seas. This is the story of the SS Badger State, a victory ship loaded with bombs, and the bombs broke loose just before Christmas of 1969. The bombs broke loose, the crew had to evacuate the ship, and many of the crew died when their lifeboat was hit by a bomb that came out of the vessel and sank the lifeboat. A pretty horrific story that happened. But it also, one of the things I do in my booklet is go a little bit more in depth in what was the underlying cause for that and what was being done to fix that. They actually had loaded that ship in rain, and the dunnage, the wooden dunnage that's used to block and brace the cargo, had become wet, and when it dried out, it loosened and the bombs broke loose. Another interesting story, this is a story entitled The Eagle Mutiny. This is about the SS Columbia Eagle, which 2 members of the crew staged a bomb threat on the ship, had half the crew evacuate the vessel, and then hijacked the vessel and sailed it to Cambodia. That's right, a mutiny on board a U.S. commercial vessel. An amazing story of those 2. One of the crew members eventually surrenders himself. He is tried for mutiny, sentenced to 10 years in prison. The other one escapes into Cambodia and disappears during the Khmer Rouge uprising that follows. And then the last book, and there's many books that look at this subject, but I like this book because it looks at it from the perspective of the Merchant Marine crew. This is 4 Days of Mayaguez. Mayaguez is one of those container ships that had come into Vietnam. It is going to be seized by the Khmer Rouge off the coast of Cambodia. Some acknowledge it as the last action of the Vietnam War. The ship is grabbed, seized, and then there is an effort by Marines, Air Force, Navy to take the ship back, including a boarding done from a U.S. Navy at the time destroyer escort, later on a frigate, including 6 merchant mariners from the USNS Greenville Victory who come on board. Amazing story here that happens. There's a lot about the Vietnam War, but one of the things I want to talk about here is what are the lessons learned from the Vietnam War. So 4 lessons learned come out of the Vietnam War. One is that reserve fleet, the National Defense Reserve Fleet, is getting long in the tooth. It was created in 1946. It had been an uneven activation of ships from the reserve. About 172 ships were activated from the National Defense Reserve Fleet, costing about $500,000 apiece to activate. Some failed. There was actually a catastrophic boiler explosion on one. And so the decision was made to create a higher level of readiness, and that is the creation of what is today known as the Ready Reserve Force. This is a part of the National Defense Reserve Force made up of ships deemed necessary for Sealift missions. The problem today is that fleet is very old. On average, the ships, over 50 ships in that fleet, on average, the ships are over 44 years of age. Second, the idea of a float prepositioning comes in. Just prior to the Vietnam War, the United States had created what were called floating forward depots, FFDs. These were Victory ships prepositioned with equipment loaded out into the Pacific area. The plan was to load 19 Victory ships. Only 3 of them had been loaded before the Vietnam War. They were subsequently offloaded in Vietnam. Their equipment was used for the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. But after the war, the decision is made to kind of rekindle this idea, particularly after the events take place in Iran with the taking of the U.S. Embassy, the failure to rescue the hostages at Desert One. The Marines decide to establish 3 afloat prepositioning squadrons. Each squadron would carry enough equipment, fuel, materiel, vehicles for a Marine brigade of over 16,000 personnel for 30 days. The need to be able to deploy equipment quickly from the United States proved paramount, and so the Fast Sealift Ship program, the FSS program, was created. 8 of those Sealand container ships that were used on the European route, which were deemed unviable because of their speed. Malcolm McLean had invented these, the SL-7s. These ships sailed at 33 knots. The problem was they consumed 6 barrels of fuel a mile. A barrel is 42 gallons. So these are very fuel inefficient vessels, but high speed is something that the military wanted. The ships were taken into the U.S. military, converted. Their midsections were converted to carry roll-on, roll-off cargo. They still carried containers forward and aft. These ships were seen as being essential to be able to deploy equipment quickly. 7 of the 8 of them were used at the beginning of Operation Desert Shield in 1990. They were used again in 2003 in Iraqi Freedom, and they are about to start to phase out of the Ready Reserve Force. They're over 50 years old today. The last lesson learned really was this idea of transitioning refueling vessels off the coast of Vietnam. U.S. vessels maintained a position off the coast of North Vietnam, what was called Yankee Station. There was also Dixie Station off the south coast of Vietnam, but that wasn't used throughout the war. And oilers, U.S. Navy oilers, cycled into the area to refuel the aircraft carriers and then off the gun line to refuel destroyers and cruisers off the gun line. But the need for fuel was so large that the oilers were running back to Subic Bay, to Guam, in some cases to the United States to get fuel. The decision was made to start transitioning some of the older oilers over to military Sealift Command to put civilian crews. The very first one that is the USNS Toluga, what becomes known as the Toluga Tigers in 1972. They're followed by USNS Marius. The transition of Toluga over to an oiler was key. These ships now could do underway replenishment. They could either replenish U.S. Navy oilers and fast combat ships, or they can directly refuel U.S. Navy warships. These were better than consolidation tankers that had been used in the past. Consolidation commercial tankers could only refuel with other underway replenishment vessels. But Toluga could refuel with any vessel because it could fly the rigs off of it. Today, every underway replenishment vessel in the U.S. Navy is operated by Military Sealift Command with a civilian crew on board. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode looking at the Korean and Vietnam War. A lot to look at, a lot of lessons come out of both those conflicts, but they were really seminal events for the creation of MSTS and its transition over to Military Sealift Command. On our next episode, we're going to look at missions that aren't quite in the highlight of what MSC does, but very important. We're going to look at sonar surveillance. We're going to look at range instrumentation vessels, all the special mission vessels that are out there that don't get a lot of attention, along with some very unique operations that MSTS and MSC did during this time period that kind of fly below the radar, but yet were absolutely essential for the U.S. military. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly or yearly subscriber. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.